Thank you very much. Colleagues, I'd like to start by welcoming Madam Elisa Ferreira, who is the Commissioner-designate for Cohesion and Reform. I would also like to welcome members of the Regional Development Committee, as well as members of the Budget Committee, the Econ Committee as well. As you know, these are associate committees. I'd also like to welcome the colleagues from the Commission and Council who are here today as well. The hearing is broadcast live on the Parliament's website, and you will also have access to a video recording of the hearing on the same website. In line with the guidelines for approval of the Committee Annex 7 of our regulation. The European Parliament has to evaluate the Commissioners designate based on their general competency, their European engagement, and their personal independence. The Parliament also evaluate their knowledge of their future portfolio as well as their communication abilities. I would just like to remind you that the Legal Affairs Committee has not raised any objections to holding this hearing. The Commissioner-designate has already answered a preparatory questionnaire. Her written responses have been made available to all members of our committee in all languages. I would now like to briefly explain how this hearing will be structured. To start, the Commissioner-designate can make an opening statement that should be no longer than 15 minutes. Following that introduction, 25 questions will be asked by members. Each member will have 5 minutes for their part of the debate. 1 minute to ask a question. There will then be 2 minutes for a response from the Commissioner-designate. Then 1 minute for a response to a follow-up question. The follow-up question should be no more than a minute. The first round of questions will be asked by representatives of the political groups. Then the second series of 18 questions will be shared between political groups. And there'll also be one representative of the non-attached members. Following that debate, I'll give the floor to Madame Ferreira, the Commissioner-designate for Cohesion and Reforms, and she can make a closing statement of no more than 5 minutes. Finally, I will take the floor to close the meeting. I'd just like to emphasize the fact that all speakers must stick to the time allotted for questions and answers. Otherwise, we will be running late, and that will mean that some members won't be able to take the floor. That would be rather annoying. Like we have in plenary, there will be a clock showing you how long you've been speaking for. If you run over, then I will have to use my hammer and to take the floor from you. That's not something that I ever like to do, but I may have to. We have interpretation in 23 languages, and so all speakers can speak in their mother tongue. but please remember that what you're saying has to be interpreted, so please don't speak too quickly to make life easier for the interpreters. Commissioner-designate, before I give you the floor, I would just like to say that the next 5 years are going to be fundamental for the future of cohesion. Although significant efforts have been made through our policies, we have over 350 billion euros made available in the current programming period. However, despite that, we're seeing an increase in fragmentation in Europe. We've got until 2020 to renegotiate this and to renegotiate all cohesion regulations. For example, the Social Fund, the ERDF, and a number of others. And I hope that the progress we make here will allow us to have new simplified regulations However, these policies can only be effective if we have the right budget. The European Parliament and our Regional Development Committee, as well as the budget committees, will fight for this when it comes to negotiations on the future MFF. Cohesion is under pressure everywhere to cut budgets, to deal with new urgencies, and to change the way it works. The link in your portfolio between cohesion and structural reform can also help to allay some of our concerns. Commissioner-designate, we need to have a strong cohesion commissioner, a commissioner who will be strong within the European Commission in order to ensure that they carry forward our shared ambition, to ensure that Articles 174 and 175 are defended in all EU policies. We also need a commissioner who will listen to the Regional Development Committee. And we welcome Madam van der Leyen's suggestion to allow the Parliament right of initiative. Without development throughout its territories, without cohesion, then we won't have a shared future in Europe. Cohesion in Europe will be the best prevention against fracture in Europe. And that's very much at the heart of the European project. I'm sure this is going to be a very rich debate and hearing. And Madam Elisa Ferreira, it's now my pleasure to give you the floor for 15 minutes before we move on to the debate with the members of the committee. You have the floor, Madam.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Chairman, members, friends, it's a great pleasure for me and an emotional experience for me indeed to be before you today. I'll be continuing in one of the working languages of the Commission, but I'll be doing that to try and communicate directly with you. So I'll now start speaking in English.
12 years as a member here and enjoyed every single day here in the heart of Europe. What a pleasure to see old colleagues from the Econ, from Regi, from budget committees. Today, I am honored to present a proposal for our work together for the next 5 years. As a former member of this Parliament, I understand the importance of the work you do. I truly believe that only by joining forces can we build hope and trust in the European project for all Europeans, wherever they were born. I pay tribute to my predecessor, Corina Crețu. Corina, your motto was, "No region left behind." I will make it my motto too, adding, of course, my own energy, my own experience. Today, this motto is more relevant than ever. Globalization, digital revolution, climate change, all of them risk leaving regions behind. There may be opportunities in the long term, but the change is painful. I saw this pain with my own eyes as a junior economist in the late 80s, responsible for a pilot cohesion program. It was a difficult time for the textile industry and a difficult time for communities who depended on this industry. We have seen it again very recently in the aftermath of 2008. Some of you are still seeing it today. Different industries, different places, but we all know the story. Never forget the closed factories, the lost jobs. Never forget squeezed wages, squeezed pensions. Never forget the bright young people who leave. Cohesion is at the heart of the European project, and reform with cohesion must be at the top of our agenda. As globalization and ever faster technology change put extreme pressure on local economies. Honourable members, I believe in this policy because I have seen its impact on the ground. From my time as a young economist in development to my time as regional planning minister, I have seen cohesion policy as a lever of change across Europe, and for some regions, the only lever available. From the Arctic to the Mediterranean, from urban areas to former industrial regions, from coal-dependent regions to the outermost regions of the EU, from mountain regions to rural areas, from border regions to peripheral coastal areas. Europe must act and be seen by citizens to act. An economy that must work for people, with intervention tools tailored to the need of each territory, helping the transition to a digital, green, and gender-balanced economy. No region, no person left behind. So, honourable members, I am honoured and thrilled to be called to this portfolio. Our President-elect, Ms. von der Leyen, has entrusted me with 6 key tasks. Some are rather urgent. First, the legislative framework. Ms. von der Leyen emphasized, and I agree, the need for swift agreement so that programs can be up and running on day 1. I count on your immediate support. Let us work together. A new Just Transition Fund will also be an immediate task, inspired by a Parliament proposal to support regions where the transition to a climate-neutral economy is more challenging, namely industrial, coal and energy-intensive regions. You will be hearing from us soon with a Commission proposal in the first 100 days. My second task, smooth implementation. My mission letter is crystal clear. The future policy should be modern, simple to use, and lead to high-quality investment. We must work closely with Member States in simplifying and streamlining procedures without jeopardizing the quality of controls. Sectoral and centrally managed programs must also play a role, taking account of spatial impact and, as far as possible, creating effective synergies with cohesion policy. The Commission proposals are ambitious. For example, simplify cost options, freeing small beneficiaries from keeping mountains of invoices for years, saving up to 25% in administrative costs. We will be checking if these measures deliver as promised. I see you as my ally in delivering these and other simplifications. My third task, reforms. Monetary union is challenging, particularly when countries differ in competitiveness, particularly also when they face different economic and social circumstances. Achieving sustainable, long-term convergence founded on competitiveness is our key goal in this context. Investments and reforms have a crucial role here. Therefore, it is high time to restart the discussion on the new investment support instruments, the Reform Support Programme, and the budgetary instrument for convergence and competitiveness for the euro area. The euro is the currency of Europe. We must offer timely support to all those countries which have already joined the single currency, as well as to those seriously working to join. Reforms must be aligned with the European semester, but they must also be proposed and endorsed by the country concerned. Their scope must be the removal of bottlenecks to sustainable growth and convergence, stimulating higher levels of competitiveness through the support of national programs, going from modernizing public administration to reforming the education and training system or improving forest management. Reform and cohesion must work together. They must reinforce each other, not come at each other's expense. Taxpayers should not fund policies which contradict or ignore each other. I am committed to work closely with the Parliament, and I believe these instruments should follow the community method. Your support will be key. We must work together to make visible progress in the first 100 days and to adopt the programme in time. My fourth task, sustainable development of cities and urban areas. The upcoming review of the EU urban agenda is an opportunity. Cities today are often the home of poverty, of exclusion, inadequate housing, inefficient transport, and aggressive damage to environment and climate. These all call for our attention, but there is an opportunity too. Cities can lead, must lead, in the digital and green economy. The opportunities are there, and we must seize them in close cooperation with national and local partners. I will kick off the discussion at the Cities Forum, January 2020 in Porto. If you can make it, I would love to show you my hometown. My fifth task, fully exploit the treaty provisions for the outermost regions. I recognize the specific needs of these regions. They require particular attention. Also mountainous, peripheral, and cross-border regions, but these regions are special. So I welcome the present inclusion of a specific outermost region dimension in no less than 21 different post-2020 legislative proposals, from fisheries to research, from transport to climate change. Some of these points have already passed trilogue, others we must fight to maintain, and again, I count on your help. My sixth and final task, communication. This policy has done so much for so many citizens, and still it is not well known enough. My goal is to visit the regions to understand local concerns and local aspirations, to encourage faster and better implementation of projects, and to let communities know they are not left behind. In this context, I intend to always inform you when I go to your region. In fact, I will regularly update you on all my initiatives. I will ensure a special partnership with the European Parliament, particularly with committees that are here today. This is a priority for the President-elect, but it is also a priority for me. I have talked about my mission. Let me finish with a few words about myself and what I bring to the table. First, I truly believe in this portfolio and am committed to making it work. My attachment to this policy is deeply personal. I have lived it in every season of my adult life. My academic interests long ago, master's and PhD, were in regional policy and European integration. I learned compelling arguments for cohesion and reform, as well as the intellectual framework. As a junior economist, for more than a decade, I worked with cohesion policy on the ground. I saw its impact on the lives of individuals. More recently, as Minister for Planning, I negotiated the Portuguese Community Support Framework for 2000-2006. The Commissioner then was Michel Barnier. Proof that cohesion policy prepares you for anything. As a member of the European Parliament, in the Econ Committee, and then as a central banker, I learned the complexity of different key economic files and their interconnection. I learned, too, the wisdom of the old motto: competitiveness and cohesion must grow together for the European project to thrive. From academia to program manager, from minister to MEP to central banker, I bring all these perspectives. The ability to take different perspectives brings me to the second thing you should know about me. I will be a team player. I will work closely with you. I will work closely with my Commission colleagues. I will work closely with regions, cities, and local people. The eyes of history are upon us. The first female president, the first fully gender-balanced college, and the first female candidate for Portuguese commissioner. We have shown that the glass ceiling can be broken so that competent women can rise to responsible roles. I will rise to this responsibility. Our team, for all the talents, will make history proud. Finally, I truly believe in this Europe of ours. This started long before my academic work on European integration. In my hometown, there is a monument to Willy Brandt, one-time Chancellor of Germany, an icon of European democracy. Each time I pass, I remember my youth, growing up in a dictatorship. Europe meant democracy, and I shared Mário Soares' vision of a free Portugal rejoining the European family. Europe still means democracy to me. Working on the ground, I learned that Europe means solidarity, because there is no real democracy if you are deprived of education or health or are socially excluded. Europe still means solidarity to me today. When I became an MEP, I learned that Europe means friendship, mutual respect, shared values, and nations united in variety. Europe still means all that and much more to me today. Honourable members, this Europe of democracy, of solidarity, of friendship and shared values in diversity, this Europe calls on us today. As we transition to the digital age, to the green economy, this Europe calls us to be bold. Bold in promoting cohesion, bold in reforms, so that no person, no region is left behind. Let us answer the call together. Monsieur le Président, je veux répondre à cet appel.
Chairman, I want to respond to that call. It's an honour for me to be candidate as Commissioner in charge of cohesion and reforms. It's a great pleasure for me to respond to your questions. Thank you very much.
Madame la commissaire désignée, je vous remercie.
Madam Commissioner-designate, I think you impeccably respected your speaking time there. We'll be able to move on to the debate. We will be starting with the coordinators representing the political groups. I'll recall that we have 5-minute slots. That will allow for a 1-minute question, a 2-minute response by the Commissioner, then a follow-up question of a maximum of 1 minute, and a response to the question for another 2 minutes. To start with, I'll be giving the floor to my colleague Andrei Novakov for the EPP Group.
Dear Commissioner-designate, I feel proud today, because you are facing the EPP team, cohesion team, which stood strong when everybody else was speaking about cuts and the end of the cohesion policy. This team, Madam Commissioner-designate, along with other political groups, is the rocket carrier of the strong position that this Parliament adopted for the future of the cohesion policy. This very same team granted us a mandate just a few hours ago to start negotiations for the future of this policy. Therefore, I'm asking you, would you support this team and the Parliament's position to defend the budget of the cohesion policy, or you still believe the cuts are necessary and this is the best we can get from the cohesion, judging from your written answers? Would you support the Parliament position to recover the co-financement rate for the poorest regions, or you still believe the poorest regions should pay more? Thank you very much.
Dear Mr. Novakov, honorable member, I thank you very much for this question because it will help me to clarify some concepts. In fact, I think the proposal that the Commission has presented is a basis for work. It's no more than that. It's a basis for work that includes several issues that are positive and that I find very adequate. There is a big constraint. The constraint is that when we organize the budget here, we discuss expenditure, but we don't decide on income. The income is decided by you and by the member states. So it is in the dialogue between the two co-legislators that you will decide what is the budget that we can use. So I will, in the Commission and everywhere, I will definitely support the highest possible level, not because I'm a candidate for this post, but because I truly believe that Europe cannot deepen, cannot enlarge, and still keep reduced means to support the policies. Of course, the final outcome will be definitely a limited one, and so we have got to be very careful in the way we manage this policy and in the way we analyze the spatial impact of the sectoral policies. But definitely, within the margin of maneuver that we'll possibly have, I will be campaigning near my colleagues in the Commission for the highest possible level of financial framework so that we can deliver what we are aiming at.
Thank you very much for your answer, Madam Commissioner-designate. I do agree that the cohesion policy is the gravity that keeps that union together. But I'm sure that no one outside this room is understanding why cohesion policy is implementing so slowly. So how do you intend to avoid the delay in implementation of cohesion policy, having in mind that year before the end of the cohesion programming period, the implementation is just 30%?
I think we have got to analyze what are the circuits that the beneficiaries have to comply with to accede to the money. On these grounds, the present proposal from the Commission is very clear. Simplification is at the center of the agenda. There are more than 80 proposals that apparently are, that the Parliament agrees also, that will be implemented. I just hope that in the Council we have the same common understanding. The purpose of the policy is to deliver, and so we have to understand very clearly if there are impediments in this delivery, if there are other problems, but definitely we have got to speed up so that citizens feel on the ground the impact of this effort that all of us are doing so that Europe can work as a not segmented space and a more united, where everybody, all citizens, wherever they are, they can feel that they are part of this project, and that's the objective of the whole thing. Thank you.
Merci.
Thank you very much. I'll now give the floor to the Socialist Group, our colleague Constanze Kreel.
Dank, Herr Vorsitzender.
Yes, thank you very much, Chairman. Madam Commissioner-designate, Mrs. Ferreira, Elisa, the European Union faces major challenges: globalization, digitalization, the combat against climate change, creating good jobs, many others. How can cohesion policy contribute to reducing the disparities between regions? How can it allow us to achieve those objectives?
Honourable Member, querida Constance, eu penso que o programa que...
I think that the program that we are dealing with at the moment is going to deal with all of these problems. We're going to accelerate convergence. Accelerating convergence means we have to be very cautious as to how we use the funds that we have available to us. These funds, well, I hope they'll be increased, but they are scarce. We always have new items on our agenda. The overall envelope means that we have to think about what we're going to do to respond to the challenges of the future: a green transition, sustainability, digitalization, the new society. But we need to focus those funds on those regions that need them most. We need to look at the poorest regions, the least developed regions. And in that context, we shouldn't forget the outermost regions. They deserve special attention on our part. And we also need to look at those regions that are in transition. Maybe these are regions that were previously very industrialized, but are now facing crisis. They have to transform their model, and we need to put together a package for working with these regions. In many cases, they're heavily dependent on coal and heavy industry, and they need to make a transition rapidly and effectively. That's why we're working on the Just Transition Fund, which is going to deal with precisely this kind of issue. We need to be in a position to adapt our instruments to the characteristics of each region. We need to have a certain amount of flexibility that can allow us to accelerate the convergence process.
Thank you very much. My second question is, how do you think cohesion policy can contribute to the fight against climate change and help steering the Union toward a carbon-neutral future? And where do you see the role of cohesion policy within the new European Green Deal?
Thank you very much. I think this is a very important question because we have got it for the moment. We have got a compromise in relation to the regional fund that 30% of the allocations and of the payments of the regional fund in the future period 2021-27 will be allocated to climate compatible projects. And the threshold is higher, it's 37% for the Cohesion Fund. Given that these two funds represent 25% of the European budget, and together with the Social Fund, they represent 1/3, this is a full package that will make a new impulse towards a better and a quicker compliance of Europe to the objectives, to the climate objectives. We have, in the past, we already had some efforts. We had about 21% of the past community package dedicated to climate projects. Now it has been increased. And on top of this, we have a series of lines that can be worked together so that we leverage the whole amount of the climate package.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. On behalf of the Renew Europe group, I'll give the floor to our colleague, Andrej Knotek.
Good evening, Madam Ferreira. I would have a question on the Just Transition Fund as a key tool for the transition to low-carbon economy. This Just Transition Fund, could you please share with us how you plan to design the fund, how you see the financing of the fund, and the eligibility criteria for the projects and regions to be supported? And on the top of that, as with the proposal of the MFF, there is offered a cut for the cohesion policy, and at the same time, the Just Transition Fund is not included. If there is any possibility to have a guarantee or kind of a commitment that you will try to achieve that financing of this fund won't put additional pressure on the cohesion budget. Thank you very much.
Honourable Member, Mr. Andrzej Knotek, I think your question is a very important one because the Just Transition Fund has been positioned by the President-elect as one of the brand marks of this Commission. It was initially requested by this Parliament. We cannot forget that in 2018. There was a resolution even in this Parliament, and I think we have here at least one of the co-rapporteurs, either Gardia Bal, asking for 4.8 billion to support it. But the Parliament also was asking for a budget of 1.3 of GNI at that moment. So what I can offer you at this moment as a promise is that this will be a fund. It will happen. We are still working in the Commission in a preparatory work of the Commission because we are all candidates. But we are working on tailored support, locally based, that will combine elements of pure investment with elements of a social network, so that we bring these regions into a new paradigm, a more environment and climate-related paradigm that is more sustainable to the future. In the meantime, we are looking at all the details of where will be the funding for this fund. I will be working very closely with the Executive Vice President for the European Green Deal, with Commission for Energy, with Commissioner for Budget and Administration, but honestly, it is too early to tell you where the money will come from. I think I would prefer to have here a complementary origin to the Commission proposal that would bring really fresh money, but I cannot make any promise at this stage because we are still working, first of all, on the overall framework and then on how we can organize the financing of this fund, but it will exist and it will take a particular care in relation to these regions very dependent on industry, very dependent on coal and on energy consumption. Thank you.
Many thanks for your answer. And to build up on your answer, I would like to ask specifically on the coal regions, because they are said to be the most impacted regions by the transition to the low-carbon economy. And I would like to ask you how you see the role of the coal regions as the beneficiaries in this Just Transition Fund, if we can count that they will be the main beneficiaries, the coal regions, the main beneficiaries. Thank you very much.
The reason why this Just Transition Fund has been created is to give an answer to the more complex situations in terms of organizing this transition. And combined with the cohesion funds that we already have, to go on a local basis and to try to bring these regions to a new paradigm, as I mentioned before. So they will be necessarily one of the targets. I cannot say if they will be the only one. We'll analyze carefully what kind of other cases need this kind of support. The purpose is to deliver and to help these regions to catch up and to quickly get rid of this burden on their shoulders that is a burden for whole Europe and that we have got to solve. Thank you.
Merci.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is our colleague Nicholas Ninas for the Greens.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, the honourable members. Ms. Ferreira, I'm very happy that climate change is a big issue for this committee, and I also want to ask something about the climate change, because climate change is the biggest threat to humankind. It's the biggest challenge that we face, not just as Europeans, but as mankind. The people of Europe agree that immediate action is needed. And that is why we saw an uprising wave of young and active Europeans protesting for climate action. That's why we saw an election campaign that resolved almost only around this issue. And that's why we saw in the election results a clear mandate for climate action. Ms. von der Leyen followed the Greens' example and announced that she will want to reduce greenhouse gas emission by up to 55% until 2030. Cohesion policy plays a major role in tackling climate change. That is why we propose to use 50% of cohesion spending to tackle climate change directly. Will you, Mrs. Ferreira, ensure that cohesion policy follows this objective? By increasing climate spending to at least 50%, will you strive for the implementation of comprehensible guidelines for climate actions in the DGs under your supervision? And how exactly will you ensure that the operative programs contribute to decarbonize EU funding?
Thank you very much. This is a crucial question because the fight against climate change cannot be allocated here or there. It has got to be horizontal. It has to be embodied in all the policies. And I think this Commission, and in particular the compromise that has been taken by the President-elect, is very clear on those grounds. Of course, for this, we have got to be very specific and to be able to organize in a very careful way the different instruments that we have at our disposal. I think having already the target for 2030 and the target for 2050 calls for huge, massive investment. So this massive investment has got to touch not only the cohesion policy, that's for sure, and we have the thresholds for the different types of regions asking for a minimum engagement that goes from 30% to 60% according to the level of the regions and countries, level of development. Then you have to work with the Innovation Fund and the ETS. You have got to work with the Horizontal Europe. You have got to work with redeployment of the existing instruments, and I'm thinking of InvestEU, of a Globalization Adjustment Fund. So we have got to combine the IB. So we have got to combine all these instruments so that we really make a leap in this path towards the objectives, but we cannot fool ourselves. That will be extremely costly and extremely difficult technically, so that everybody can make the right path at the right speed and an increased speed. So it's very demanding, but it is clearly, the DNA of this Commission, definitely so.
Thank you. Regions that now rely on energy-intensive industries face the biggest challenge to sustain the viable living conditions. We therefore welcome the Just Transition Fund that we already talked about, but this has to apply only on those coal and intensive energy regions. We also think that the JTF has to invest in structures that are 100% carbon-free. That is crucial to prepare affected regions for the future. It can fulfill the purpose only if it ensures that regions receive the necessary support to transform in its entirety. And this includes social and also economic dimension, and major investments in human capital are crucial for this. Do you support the withdrawal from the coal energy until 2030 as it's required by the Paris Climate Agreement, and how will you make sure that the JTF includes the social dimension? How will you ensure that the JTF contributes to a reduction of the risk of poverty in the targeted regions? And for the question of funding of my colleague, do you agree that the emissions trading scheme should internalize the externalities of emissions and therefore should fund the JTF?
In a very short answer, I would say we should explore definitely the use of ETS for that purpose, definitely. And of course, we have got to work on the details of the programs. Programs cannot be effective if you don't combine the social element, if you don't combine the investment element, and of course, the economic element. So everything has got to be combined so that the program works. So if you take a local basis to do this, of course you've got to combine this, and this is the reason why I value very much also the fact that we should combine the operation of the Just Transition Fund with objective number 5, that is the integrated operation of the different instruments on a certain region that comes from the cohesion policy and from the guidelines that we have established. So I think we should work with them together and try to organize a sustainable path for these regions. Definitely so, I agree completely.
Merci beaucoup. Pour le groupe.
Thank you very much. On behalf of the ID Group, I'll give the floor to Francesca Donato.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Je veux parler.
Thank you, Chair. I'll be speaking in Italian. Thank you very much, Commissioner-designate. I much appreciate your openness and your spirit of cooperation with the European Parliament. Can I ask this? Does the Commission intend to reduce the percentage of co-financing for the structural funds, because the crisis which justified high co-financing rates is now behind us? But there are less well-off regions such as the islands and the Mezzogiorno, the south of Italy, where there is still tremendous need for support in order to get access to those funds. And could we not have modulated structural funds, given the fact that socioeconomically the regions still diverge considerably?
Well, thank you very much for that question. I think the issue of development in the south of Italy is one that we really need to look at. It's a lesson to all of us about the difficulties that exist when we try to give dynamism to a region. I think the example that you described is one that reminds us of the need to ensure that we have strong institutional structures that are capable of managing the structural funds, capable of analysing and taking decisions. And we have to also take into account the specific conditions of different regions and the different stakeholders. I think that the question that underlay what you were saying was the co-financing rate. You'll be aware that in 2009, the co-financing rates were increased. So that's to say, there was more EU contribution to national projects. And that was a response to the problems caused by the 2008 financial crisis. It was these changes that allowed some anti-cyclical intervention that this was able to compensate for some of the cuts in investment that took place at the time. But we now need to look at how we could return to a normal situation again. We have to do that very cautiously. It's a task that we shouldn't hurry into. We shouldn't change the co-financing rate without being aware of the impact that this will have, but that is the road that we have to take. Thank you.
Grazie mille. Le chiedo.
Thank you very much for that. Can I ask you another question? In the MFF, given the prospect of cuts affecting the Cohesion Fund and the CAP, will you be fighting any attempt at diverting or hijacking cohesion funding to the stage where the cohesion policy becomes less efficient and loses its priority, which we've had because of other policy aims?
Personally, I think that the new policies, at least in theory, should receive new funding. The traditional policies like cohesion policy and the agriculture policy cannot be simply seen as a constant source of new funds. But now, with the United Kingdom leaving the EU budget has been substantially reduced. But at the same time, we have a whole new range of priorities and a new range of needs that, of course, have to find a place in our agenda. So I'll try and respond as I did to the first question. The overall budget is in the hands of the two co-legislators. If there's an improvement of the MFF, I think that this would be important and it would be very good. So personally, within the College of Commissioners, I will do my best. I will fight to ensure that that is the path that is followed. But It is a time for all of us to think very carefully. I'm thinking of the Parliament, but also the Commission. It's time for us to think about own resources once again. Thank you very much.
Merci. J'invite Raphaël Fito.
Thank you. I'd ask Raphael Fitio to ask his question on behalf of the ECR.
Innanzitutto vorrei dire.
Well, I'd like to start by saying to the Commissioner-designate that I very much appreciated the introductory remarks she made, because I think a lot of the issues do seem to be in line with the work that we have to do as this committee. My question is on macroeconomic conditionality. The European Parliament has voted against this in cohesion policy. So I'd just like to ask you what your position is on this. And specifically, can you reassure this committee that the European Commission won't take other initiatives on this? And secondly, still on conditionality, the outgoing Commission in its MFF proposed new conditionality on the rule of law and suggested suspending funds to member states that violate the rule of law condition. The Court of Auditors raised this issue and said there was too much discretional power here. It was excessive. And so it only gave partial support. What's your opinion on that?
Senhor Deputado.
Thank you very much for your question. So there's the question there of macroeconomic conditionality on the economic side. Well, as a member of this Parliament, I had the opportunity to draw attention to the problems that could be caused by applying macroeconomic conditionality in a pro-cyclical manner. The effects, of course, would be felt by local authorities, small companies, bodies that are not in a position to change the overall management of the public finances. I was pleased to see that the Commission has made some good proposals, but has not removed that macroeconomic conditionality. It's important that there should not be any automatic use of a rule of law conditionality. You have to remember the importance of the proportionality principle. So automatic application would not be desirable at all. It's a very sensitive issue, but those are the rules. There's another aspect that I think is very important, and that is that if you have a very serious economic crisis, the Commission can propose to the Council that the suspension of payments can be withdrawn. On the rule of law specifically, we're talking about European rules. Rules on a question of principle. All we can do is apply the law, and the management of these funds in legal terms requires that the countries concerned fulfill the basic rules of constitutional and democratic functioning. If there is a risk that a country would not live up to the standards in these areas, then it is the responsibility of the Commission to investigate and eventually, possibly, suspend payments. Those are the two subjects that you raised, and that's the response I can give you at this point.
Sì, un'altra domanda.
Well, another question I had for you was on the Stability Pact and co-financing resources. This is a battle that we fought a number of times in this committee. We think it's useful to discuss this, how we can exclude national co-financing funds from cohesion policy, and how we can do that.
O mandato que foi.
Well, the mandate that we've received from the guidelines, from the speech that was made by the President-elect, was to have a look at the flexibility rules within the Stability and Growth Pact. There are various ways this could take place in practice. I think that what you're talking about is something that's been discussed previously in this Parliament. That's to say, there would be a golden rule. Well, I don't think that we can make isolated proposals here. This is all being reassessed. It's going to be a subject of debate within the Commission, and I will be playing an active role together with my colleagues as to how we can work together with Vice President Dombrovskis and the Commissioner-designate for the economy. We have to look at the pact. I don't think that we should be rejecting or endorsing any of these proposals at the moment. This all has to be discussed as a whole.
Nous allons conclure ce premier tour.
Thank you. So that brings us to the end to to conclude the first round of questions, we'll have Martina Michels for the GUI.
Ich freue mich natürlich.
Thank you very much. Madam Commissioner-designate, I'm happy to hear you confirm your determination to get agreement by year's end on the cohesion package. But I'm a bit alarmed that in the written replies, there was no criticism or any doubt expressed on the proposals from the previous Commission, your predecessors, when it comes to the restriction to two priorities, to innovative and digital support and climate protection. Cohesion is more than just that. Where do you see the need for cohesion and social transformation and a whole range of things?
Honourable Member, I'm not completely sure if I completely understood your question. If it is, if you are referring to the construction of the proposal of the Commission, I think the elements that you mentioned are covered there, because there is a clear understanding that when you intervene in a certain area, you have got to combine social elements with climate elements, with economic elements, and that is the combination that will make the convergence be effective. But if I didn't understand completely, please clarify what you mean.
Meine Frage zielt.
Thank you. The purpose was the contractually agreed agreement on cohesion and bringing standards of living closer together. It seems to me that that has been left out as being the prime objective of the cohesion policy. Can I ask about the European semester? In your days as a member of the European Parliament, you were quite right in saying that the European semester was not a very democratic process. How can you describe concrete structural reforms which don't seek to maximise returns or balance budgets, but instead to improve people's living conditions?
Muito obrigada. Eu vejo...
Well, thank you very much. I see structural reform in this context as a means to allow countries within the euro and the countries that want to join should be able to be in a financial position to carry out essential reforms for convergence. When I'm talking about reforms, I'm not talking about imposed reforms. I think I stated clearly that proposals need to be discussed with the Parliament. But if you take part in a single currency, when there is an adjustment, and it's difficult for countries to fulfill the requirements for balances for public finances and healthy public finances, then there needs to be some means to ensure that these countries manage to rapidly regain competitiveness. Over the previous financing period, we saw some positive experiences. Technical support that was provided to a number of countries, training, reforms to the education system, reforms to the tax collection systems. So these are all of the different facets. And it's going to be the same unit that will be working on these proposals. I'll put it in English.
Specific recommendations os
country reform programs and country-specific recommendations, particularly in Annex B, have got a lot more content in them than they did in the past. But there's a lot of work still to be done improving this process. And that is going to need the involvement of the Parliament. All of us are going to have to be much more involved, are going to be much more proactive in determining the contents of these recommendations and making them appropriate to the countries. When we're talking about the macroeconomic imbalances procedure, then that is something that can actually help to try and build an agenda that is serious and that can help rebuild the competitiveness of the countries concerned. These reforms need to fit in with the principles of cohesion and should not be against cohesion.
Nous allons ouvrir à présent.
Thank you. We'll now open the second round of questions and I'll give the floor to Pascal Arimont.
Merci, cher président.
Thank you, Chairman, and good evening, Mrs. Ferreira. Well, that's about as far as my Portuguese goes, so I'll continue in German. I'd like to talk to you about cross-border cooperation. You probably know the Interreg program very well. Interreg is about building bridges. Not only real bridges, but also bridges of friendship across borders to try and find shared solutions to shared problems. Now, citizens have appreciated seeing these borders become less difficult to cross, but unfortunately, it seems that there's a reduction from 10.7 billion to 4.7 billion. There's a major cutback. Now, as rapporteur for Interreg, I don't actually agree with your written remarks when you say that this is a moderate or appropriate reduction. Quite the contrary. As we're faced with increasing nationalism, we should be investing more money in overcoming borders rather than less. So that's my question. Will you stand by my side when we go to the Council? Can we at least fight for maintaining the current funding? Second question, what do you think about Component 5, the interregional innovative investments? Do you think that that's a good idea? So this Component 5 is going to be part of the EFRD? And what do you think about the sub-program Interreg Europe, which the current Commission has completely, basically cancelled?
Dankeschön. Muito obrigada. Muito obrigada.
Thank you very much. Well, sorry, I could just correct you. I didn't say in my written remarks, I didn't say that that reduction was appropriate. I said that the proposal was appropriate given the limitations. I'm not saying that the reduction was appropriate, but rather the proposal was one that is worth working on. I'll refer to what I said earlier on. It's not up to the Commission to define very ambitious overall envelopes and then end up having to reduce them, change them, delay the work on implementing the new financial framework. On Interreg, Interreg is a very interesting program, no doubt about that. I think it was back in 1990-something that I worked on the first cooperation program between the north of Portugal and Galicia in Spain. It was a really fabulous experience. And I don't think the Commission would really like to reduce the impact of Interreg. We've been doing everything possible, rather, to try and ensure that Interreg keeps running. And I'm certainly very available to you for doing this. I'm not going to go through the conditions of the program line by line with you. I don't know what flexibility is allowed within it, but I can certainly confirm that I have every interest in trying to promote the work of Interreg, because it is clearly a very important program. For many years, physical borders were a major problem, and political borders too. They were dividing people who are actually very close together. So I'm very positive about the functioning of Interreg, I can assure you.
Vielen Dank für die Antwort. Ich würde auch Ihr
Well, thank you for that answer. But your last sentence, could I apply that to a current situation, and that is Brexit? Interreg is used to a large extent by the United Kingdom. There are about 500 Interreg projects involving the UK. Now, on the exit deal, the United Kingdom committed to continuing the programs between the Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. But if there's no deal, and if there's an uncontrolled Brexit on the Halloween, then what will happen? I think that Interreg has an important role on that border, solving problems jointly and allowing people to speak to one another. Do you share my opinion that a cut to Interreg could actually endanger the relationship between these two communities? Is there a Commission plan B if there's a hard Brexit?
Como sabe, é muito difícil.
Well, as you'll be aware, it's very difficult for us to plan for a hard Brexit. Here and elsewhere, it's very difficult. It's a complex issue. We don't know what the consequences of a hard Brexit would actually be. The European Solidarity Fund would be mobilized in those circumstances in the plan that's been drafted to date. Of course, there would need to be emergency aid to those regions, or rather the countries concerned, to try and reduce the impact of a hard border caused by a hard Brexit. We would have to help the populations affected. Of course, a hard Brexit is not at all desirable. If it actually happens, we're going to have to go back over all of the details of every cooperation agreement in Interreg and elsewhere. What we've got at the moment is an emergency action plan. But let's see, do we have enough money to set up completely new custom systems? We will also have to help the companies affected. There are also people who find that their personal relationships are broken down by this hard border. So I can give you that much information, but I don't think anyone really knows what a hard Brexit would actually lead to and under what conditions that would take place. But we're keeping a close eye on it, I can assure you. Thank you.
Je cède immédiatement la parole à Isabelle Carveles.
Another refer to Isabel Carvalhais.
A Comissária-designate.
The Commissioner-designate declared your commitment to continuing one of the most fundamental policies for Europe, that's cohesion, for convergence of the internal market, for economic development and promoting investment and creating jobs. But you also have to deal with structural reforms. Reforms also always have to be accompanied with investment. How do you intend to reconcile these two aspects that in many cases seem to move in different directions? How can you ensure that the implementation of reforms is guided so that they lead to more and better cohesion, more creation of quality jobs and better skills for workers, as well as innovation across the economy, as we move towards a carbon neutral economy? Thank you.
Obrigada, Senhora Deputada.
Thank you very much. I think that for much too long, we've been talking about and asking for a budget, a financial basis for the Eurozone. Well, a single currency has led to open competition between countries without the usual disguises that would cover that up. That's to say, devaluing currencies. And there would be no automatic stabilizers either. So if there's a crisis, the crisis would be very violent. This takes place particularly if there are big imbalances between the countries that make up the European Union. If we could create real convergence, then we need to have the right policies. We need to have some kind of investment capacity to help countries so that they can move in the right direction in a faster manner. As I see it, the structural reforms we're talking about are reforms that can and must be part of the European semester, but they have to be agreed in detail with the countries concerned. The beneficiary countries have to decide what they want to propose, and there needs to be a kind of contract. So if they achieve the targets or not, then the transfers will take place. I've got two DGs under my responsibility. I've got cohesion and I've got reforms. So I think that if we carried out these structural reforms, we have to take into account the territorial impact that they have. We can't have these two sides going against each other. Rather, one has to help the other. A careful reform of the public administration can and should lead to cohesion policy, or greater cohesion. A reorganization of the education system can and should help in improving the quality of human resources and thus help with cohesion. So the two policies have to be closely linked together. They cannot be allowed to contradict each other. They cannot simply ignore the existence of the other. Structural reforms come naturally with a single currency, and cohesion is enshrined in the treaties. It's been with us for years, but we need to work on it to try and deepen the European project. Thank you. Well, I'll take the opportunity to ask you how you can use the European semester to work on the Sustainable Development Goals. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? Well, when we're talking about the European semester, we have to remember the sequence of the semester and the position of the country-specific recommendations. These recommendations should help to structurally accelerate the convergence process. And we have to remember that when they carry out these reforms, it shouldn't just be growth at any price. No, it should be genuine development. The Sustainable Development Goals are an overarching objective. We have to ensure that the development process is balanced and sustainable. I think we can't simply forget about the quality of development. We can't just focus on macroeconomic figures.
Je donne la parole au vice-président.
And now the floor to the Vice Chair, Christian Guinea.
Hi. Despite all the talking about simplification, both here in Brussels and in the member states, our beneficiaries still complain about excessive bureaucracy. How will you ensure the beneficiaries experience real simplification on the ground? And to take one example, you mentioned in your opening speech the simplified costs. To be clear, I'm a very big fan of this method. We started to implement it in Romania when I was a minister for EU funding, but it's also a problem. This solution was undermined by the concerns about possible future decision of European Court of Auditors, and I know, of course, the auditors are independent, but nevertheless, we have to assure some stability for our beneficiaries. How do you intend to work, maybe with ECA, maybe to prevent such scenario in which our beneficiaries are caught in different interpretations by different institutions?
Muito obrigada.
Yes, thank you very much. Well, I think that what you're asking me about is a very important subject. Someone told me in an informal context that small companies are actually going without community support because they're simply not in a position to hire more staff to deal with all of the documentation, all of the bureaucracy. Well, that would really contradict the objectives we've set ourselves. The whole idea is that our policies have to get down to the citizens on the ground. The measures that are being proposed by the Commission, the 80 measures, need to be accompanied by monitoring. They need to be adjusted if necessary if they do not achieve the desired result. Probably we will need to consult the beneficiaries. We will need to ask them, what do we need to improve? What do we need to simplify? How can we make the rules comparatively easy to fulfill without unnecessary bureaucracy? We need to look on the customer side. We have to keep what's necessary, but we have to clear out all of the bureaucratic requirements that are not necessary. We have to remember that we cannot weaken the safety mechanisms that ensure that money is properly spent. We have statutory requirements and treaty requirements for properly verifying expenditure. And we can't forget about that if we try to simplify the procedures.
Thank you. And my second question will be about your two hats, because you'll have a portfolio named Cohesion and Reforms, and you have this newly created DG for structural reform support. You answered previously to this idea, but just to be more specific and more clear, some voices say there will be a de facto conditionality between making reforms and spending money from cohesion. What do you think about this scenario? Are these voices right or not?
Thank you very much. I think the voices transmit a fear that there will be a kind of extra conditionality on the funds, and that the funds will be absorbed by reforms. I will try to make sure that the first reforms are adequate, that they are owned and seen as needed by the member states, that the member states understand completely and that they propose these reforms, and that these reforms actually contribute to an increase of their capacity to grow and their speed for convergence. If we look carefully at the work that was done in the context of this reform package in the past, and I mentioned it because I think it's very illustrative, the kind of work that was done by this unit was very supportive and seen as very positive in Greece, in Lithuania. I may tell you that they operated just in technical support in 26 countries, that they had proposals that doubled the capacity that the services had to do technical support, and so they are very, very positively seen. Now what we are doing is to keep this kind of support, but to have another element, that is the capacity to invest. So I believe that we are solving a problem and creating a new mechanism that will help the monetary union to function with less dangers and less risks than until now.
Merci. Je remercie notre...
Thank you. Thank you to the Vice Chair for his question. I'll now give the floor to Alvaro Amaro.
Obrigado.
Thank you very much. Commissioner-designate. Well, allow me to say the following. Today, I came to this hearing and I was rather shocked, I must say, with what I'd read. I was rather concerned. My first concern as a European citizen is that if you, as Commissioner-designate, had the necessary political will and support in the Commission, and I think that you do have the backing of the President of the Commission, then could you use this political will to try and overcome injustice? Injustices that go against cohesion. Funds going to the richer countries and not to the poorer countries, less to the poorer countries, that's the absolute antithesis of cohesion. And as a Portuguese commissioner, I mean, I think it seems a bit strange to see the things moving in this direction. Having heard your words today, you've been able to allay some of my concerns, but that's basically what I wanted to ask about. Can you confirm that I've understood correctly?
Senhor Deputado, acho que não tem de se preocupar.
I don't think you need to worry. I'm sure you realize that my commitment to cohesion did not start yesterday. But we have to take a decision. Do we have to work on the basis of the proposal that the Commission has made, or do we want a different proposal? The Commission proposal is a working document. It's a document that is drafted without knowing about the revenue side at all. It is a reasonable scenario. We know that the scenario is going to require more efforts from the contributor countries. But at the same time, it cannot fully cover the losses that we've seen, or that we are going to see, when a major net contributor in the form of the United Kingdom will be leaving. Beyond this, you know that there are new elements, environmental issues, climate change, migration, border controls, defence and security, neighbourhood policy, Europe in the world. We've got all of those. I've got my eyes on you. I've got my eyes on the Budgets Committee. I'm interested in what goes on between you and the Council. Of course, I will do everything in my power to try and ensure that the Council will get an agreement with the Parliament. I see some very effective and competent measures of this Parliament who've worked on budgets for years, and I'm sure that a good solution will emerge from the trilogues. We will be doing our best, I will be doing my best to try and ensure that this all works out.
Senhor Comissário-designate, os seus olhos estão em...
Madam Commissioner-designate, you say you've got your eyes on us, but our eyes are also on you. The President, Ursula von der Leyen, has said again and again, she's talking about low-density territories. Well, I'm very happy about that, but that raises expectations. If you have got political backing from the new President, then I believe in your convictions and your honesty. We're looking at each other eye to eye. But when we move from convictions to reality, we know about all the difficulties. But cohesion is a European objective. There might be a shortage of resources, but it cannot lead to cohesion losing out. Well, what about these low-density territories? I mean, what about the co-financing rates? How is that going to help us?
Enfim, relativamente aos...
Well, on the resources, it's not the Commission that raises the revenues. That's the Council. So, that's the Council, the Member States, that have to accept the principle and contribute more to the budget. That's what you're really asking about. That's what's at stake. As for the co-financing rates, I don't know if I have a chance to respond in full, but it was a measure. The Commission took in 2009, raising the co-financing rates because of the crisis. Now it's time to do some fine-tuning, not to have some kind of sudden break with the past, but rather we need to start moving back towards a normal situation, the situation pre-2009. Maybe if I have a bit more time, I'll try and answer that in full.
Merci. Je laisse la...
Thank you. I'll now give the floor to Madame Penkova.
Est-elle présente? Oui.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ms. Commissioner-designate. If you allow me, I will speak in Bulgarian.
Dear Mrs. Ferreira, as one of the newcomers, Bulgaria, as many other countries, has benefited enormously from the positive effects of the cohesion policy. Despite that, the northwestern region of Bulgaria is still the poorest in the entire EU. I continue to believe that EU policies, complemented with national efforts, can help address the demographic, economic challenges faced by some regions in the EU. So I would like to ask you, what kind of special measures do you have in mind to help Central and Eastern European countries reach the EU average living standard? Thank you.
Muito obrigada.
Yes, thank you very much. Cohesion policy is precisely the response to this kind of issue. I realize that change doesn't always move quickly. The economy of the least developed countries can move very slowly. There are a lot of issues such as aging of populations, difficulties in starting companies, difficulties in getting funding. But for this very reason, cohesion policy has to focus on the situations of the least developed regions. It has to work in close cooperation with other policy streams. We can't simply envisage a cohesion policy that is not linked to other policies like social policies, that isn't linked to the economy as a whole. I don't know the details of your region, but we need to work carefully to see what would work best in getting your region out of its situation. This may be a question of vocational training. It may be a question of accessibility. It might be a question of some kind of new institutional architecture that can change the social fabric. So cohesion policy should make these regions a priority, and it needs to also look carefully at the specific territory and find which instruments are most appropriate. I think that that's the right basis to work upon. And I think one important factor is the exchange of experience when it comes to strategies for regional development. Many of our countries have been through exactly that kind of situation. Interregional cooperation is a very important thing in itself, so that we can learn from each other and not repeat the mistakes of the past when we've seen that things haven't worked. I think the principle has to be no one left behind. We need to find a way to get the least developed regions to converge much more rapidly with the more developed parts of Europe.
Thank you. Question number 2. It has to do with your written answers. You say that you agree with the proposed cut for cohesion policy by 10% in the long term. At the same time, there is this proposal to increase the rate of national co-financing. I would like to ask you How will these additional measures impact on the opportunities for providing economic support exactly to the poorest regions in the EU?
Eu não vou voltar.
Well, I'm not going to repeat what I've already said. I think that the Commission's proposal was based on a large reduction. I think that that was a working hypothesis. But what's new is this co-financing rate. Co-financing rates were increased because during the period of serious economic crisis, many member states had a lot of trouble in providing the national side of the financing. So project promoters were not able to implement the projects. That the public finances were very tight. There was no margin for, no room for maneuver for carrying out this national co-financing. Some of those problems persist. Many countries still have not got this room for maneuver. But gradually, we would like to normalize co-financing rates as the economy seems to be returning to normality. If the EU co-financing is slightly lower, the leverage ends up being greater and can have greater impact. When it comes to having access to financial markets and credit, then the rates are pretty good at the moment. Project promoters should find it reasonably easy to get financing at good rates. So that should give them an opportunity to finance themselves.
Rose.
Next, Caroline Rose.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. Commissioner-designate. In recent years, we've seen that the EU has financed a number of programs that damage the environment or that local communities don't like. Often, emphasis is placed on economic interests rather than environmental and social interests. We also see the EU financing fossil fuels that contribute to climate change. The Commission hasn't taken any measures to offset the damaging effects of this. Given the climate crisis, the EU can't finance these types of projects anymore. And so we would suggest that within DG Regio, we have an office that is responsible for looking at environmental issues and economic interests and finding a balance and solving disputes. How can we do this and take real account of environmental interests? Are you willing to stop EU financing being used for the motorway in the Trosna region of Bulgaria, which is a protected natural zone?
Thank you very much. Well, as for the case you mentioned, I will check that. I am not convinced that there is any investment in environmentally damaging projects. There are investments that we simply cannot finance anymore. Things like coal mines, airports, unless these are airports in outermost regions. So there's a whole series of exclusions. So you raised the case of this motorway, the Struma motorway. I have to look into the details of that precise project. What I think is important is, of course, that European legislation should be respected. We do need to build necessary projects, provided that they also protect the values that are enshrined in the legislation. If you have a region that is under Natura 2000 protection, or is part of the UNESCO World Heritage, then of course we need to protect it. We would need to find alternative solutions, a less destructive alternative, and we would have to take mitigating measures if there is still to be an impact. So, of course, the first requirement is that we should respect the law. But then we would need to work on each project very carefully so we don't get the wrong balance between protecting the environment, which is a public good and an unquestionable one, but at the same time we have to be resolving the problems of human beings who need to continue to move around and have the necessary accessibility. So I can't tell you the solution right now, but my services are working on it and we'll keep a close eye on it.
Merci pour votre réponse.
Thank you for the answer. European financing has to be sustainable and effective. We have examples such as the Kresna Gorges, which show that we need to have better mechanisms for participation to ensure sustainable regional development. The principle of partnership is supposed to guide local planning efforts. Do you think it's enough to guarantee that all involved parties are involved in the implementation process for structural funds? More specifically, in 2020, this will be a crucial moment for participation in of partners, because that's when we'll be putting together the programs in member states. However, the texts that are supposed to involve local communities won't be adopted in the next few months. This means that the principle of partnership might not necessarily be maintained, and the communities involved might not necessarily be consulted. So what can you do to ensure that local communities' voices will be heard and will be taken into account when we're preparing programmes in 2020 in line with the Code of Conduct on Partnership? How do you see the situation being in member states in 2020?
Muito obrigada pela sua questão.
Thanks a lot for that question. I think the partnership is absolutely essential. Involving local stakeholders is absolutely essential. I will investigate the situation. I will see what is happening. In my experience, the involvement of local stakeholders is the prerequisite for allowing the projects that are implemented to be good for all concerned and ensure that there is full participation of local communities in every project. I've been responsible for some of these integrated operations, the involvement of trade unions, the involvement of local business associations, NGOs, chambers of commerce. All of this has brought added value, and I think it's all key. As for the current situation, I will investigate and keep my eye on it. The principle is an accepted principle. It's an established principle within the Commission and in the services.
Mathilde.
Next, Mathilde Androuet. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mrs. Ferreira, despite the objectives of territorial cohesion set out, some regions still are very poor, and the existence of the funds is not always optimal. Especially the outlying regions have poverty and unemployment rates which are very high. For example, 40% in Réunion, 40% in Réunion are living in poverty and 20% are unemployed. There was a report last May saying the management of EU funds had led to an increase in overheads and a drop in efficiency. Mrs. Ferreira, what will you do to ensure that regions get the full benefit out of funds which come straight from European taxpayers? In the same idea of defending the ultra-peripheral regions, there are local taxes in the regions which could be used to be a source of income, the so-called octroi de mer. This is a source of finance for the ultra-peripheral regions. And if you look at the TFEU, there are exemptions there, for example, things such as the octroi de mer, and can we expect any improvement there?
As regiões ultraperiféricas.
Well, the outermost regions are indeed a priority in the treaty. I mean, you mentioned Article 343, and they are rightly a priority for the President of the Commission, the President-elect, that is. She has drawn our attention to the need to pay special attention to the development process of these regions. They have specific difficulties, distance, difficult access. There's an exception, of course, which cannot allow a financing of airports in outermost regions, and isolation, vulnerability to climate change, specific issues, as I say. In the Commission's proposal, there are a series of proposals, 21 proposals indeed, that are directed specifically to outermost regions and at a number of different levels. They maximize access to funds. They have a minimum threshold for aid per inhabitant, and in the area of fisheries and agriculture, there are special preferences for the outermost regions. I also think that the development strategies of these regions have to pay special attention to the link between transport and the environment and other sectoral policies. These regions, many cases, are dependent on monocultures. If there's a change to trade policy or agriculture policy or the prices of sugar and certain fruits or the milk price, these changes can have a massive impact in the outermost regions. As for energy, that's particularly important because we need to look at how the regions can be developed on the basis of renewable energy. The situation is very interesting for renewable energy in many outermost regions. Tidal energy, for example, wave energy, wind energy, solar energy. In many of these regions, this can allow the regions to be self-sufficient, and they can reduce external dependency for energy sources. So we have to be very cautious.
Thank you. In the past, you've been critical of the Troika vis-à-vis Greece and Portugal. And are you prepared to break with the logic of austerity, or do you intend to continue this, knowing that it does further increase the disparities between regions?
Well, indeed. I was a critic of the excessive adjustments that were required of these countries during the Troika period. In these very rooms, in this House, I debated this in some depth. Now, as I see it, that adjustment was excessive, but Europe has learned a single currency has to have other instruments at its disposal. We now have an embryonic idea on the reforms. I think that that's a glimmer of hope that suggests that a single currency zone should be able to create convergence between countries. We need to ensure that adjustments are less painful at times of crisis. There's another element, which is the compensatory mechanisms through investment. That is something that hasn't really taken place. We need short-term investment mechanisms. Hopefully we'll be filling that gap by trying to have reinsurance of unemployment insurance. That could provide some of the short-term injection of resources that's needed in crisis.
Thank you very much. Angelika Moszczynowska.
Dziękuję bardzo, panie przewodniczący, szanowna pani.
Thank you, Chair. Commissioner-designate. Cohesion policy has very clear objectives, but they've not been reached yet. But we can't change this objective and the policy. What you said about competitiveness and cohesion, and that the fact that they go hand in hand, is very important. However, we've cut the payments more to poorer countries than to richer countries, 23 to poorer countries and 7 to richer countries such as Germany. you have to remember that services were provided under these policies. And so if members can't use these funds, then it means that there's going to be more of a slowdown in the poor countries. Do you think that these budget cuts is really going to promote effectiveness in these policies or just marginalize countries even more?
Muito obrigada.
Thanks very much. Well, I think that your question has an implicit element, which is how cohesion funds are distributed among different countries. Well, there are a number of different formulas that are used. Some of those formulas make perfect sense. If a country manages to grow, then it starts to lose access to the funds. And when you have a country that's having trouble supporting its own regions, and there are problems across the population with growth and jobs. So the formula has to be constantly corrected and improved, but it tries to create the right proportion given the relative situations of the different countries. So the fund doesn't exist outside the rules. Rather, the changes are due to the growth rates of the country. Poland has been doing a very good job. It's succeeding in converging. Congratulations on doing that. But as you are succeeding in doing it, it's only logical that you don't continue to receive quite so much. The same things that happened to Portugal and others. So the funds go preferentially to those countries that still have a long way to go. So it all depends on the trajectory of the country concerned. Of course, formulas have their limits. If the formula leads to a major reduction in funding, then I think that there should be thresholds. We can't forget overall volumes. We can't simply compare the current period with the previous programming period. When policies are successful, they naturally lead to a reduction in cohesion funding.
Dziękuję bardzo. To mam jeszcze jedną ważną kwestię.
Thank you. Another important question. Because within the Council we were able to negotiate on projects, for example, developing gas infrastructure or airport infrastructure, for example. Do you support these exclusions or the other proposals?
Well, I already responded to one question on airports. The current situation is that, except in very special cases, such as in the case of the outermost regions, airports should not be financed. They contradict the overall principle of a gradual transition to a more sustainable economy in Europe. So it is possible to build airports, of course, but what you don't get is European Union support if there's no particular reason to do so. There needs to be a justification for the additional carbon emissions. We need to have a justification for those to be financed. So that's the current situation of the rules. Of course, in specific cases, we need to have a look at how the principle is applied in practice. Thank you.
Merci.
Thank you. We are falling behind in our timetable. The follow-up question is not compulsory. It's open to members. And it has to be linked to the initial question and not a separate question. Simone Schmidbauer is next. Thank you, Chairman. Commissioner-designate. In many member states, there are trends towards decentralization in decision-making. from the central level to the regions. At the same time, in other member states, the exact opposite trend is discernible, and there's a trend towards centralisation. If regional policy is going to work and be perceptible in all of the regions, as proposed, the European Parliament has said that regional, local partners and civil society and trade unions have to be involved. The partnership principle has got to be fleshed out. However, here there is resistance at council level, which has got, they want a much more general form of words. And my question to you is this: you as Commissioner, will you encourage the Member States in future to progressively move the responsibility from central to regional level? And are you going to be pushing for a balanced relationship between the different levels of government?
Muito obrigada.
Thank you. Well, that's an important question, critical question, but I have to respect the choices made by individual countries. If you've got a program or a project that's regional in focus, then it's important that there has to be the right levels of competence and responsibility to deal with those projects properly. I'm thinking about my own country. It's a very centralized country. There's no elected government of the region, so that's a choice taken at the national level. I don't think it's for the European Commission to interfere in the internal organization of the member states.
Thank you. If I could now move on to my second question. If cohesion policy and the partnership principle as such is going to function, it depends on trust and confidence at all levels. In your initial statement, you made an offer of partnership and cooperation. And my question then is this: are there conflicts of interest? It's important right at the start of our partnership to dispel any doubts or any fears. Your partner is responsible for the allocation of regional funding in Portugal. Do you think that this could be a potential conflict of interest, yes or no?
I'll answer in English so that everybody understands. Thank you very much for this question because it allows me to explain. In fact, this links to my first answer. In Portugal, we don't have regions as such. We have administrative units. So, in fact, my husband, who is a university professor, is an economist, and he has been serving for 3 years in one of these public institutions that deals with the regional development of north of Portugal. So I believe that there is no conflict of interests as he responds to the minister, the central government minister in charge of planning. Anyway, because I'm very concerned with perceived issues, not real issues, I'm convinced that no conflict exists. It's public service, so there is no private interest that can conflict with this public interest. But I wrote to the president-elect saying very clearly that if at any time, any moment, there is any risk, and I will read what I wrote. I am ready to take all the necessary measures to prevent any perception of conflict. This means in particular that I will abstain from any participation in decisions which concern the implementation of union funds under my responsibility, which could directly or indirectly impact the personal interests of my husband as president of this institution. So if there is any personal aspect, I will completely abstain, which means that I consider myself impeded to decide, and it will be up to the Commission to decide, to the President-elect to decide or to delegate on someone else. I'm convinced that this will never happen. We are a rule-based system. My husband never met or negotiated with the previous commissioner. The previous commissioner never had anything to decide about him. But anyway, I wanted to make this clear Very simple. And so I sent this letter to President-elect, and also I will add, I'm ready to take any further measures that you may consider necessary in this respect. So this is my compromise, my public compromise.
Merci beaucoup à notre...
Thank you very much, colleague, for the question, and thank you to the Commissioner-designate for that response, which was very frank. Ms. Susana Solis-Perez is next.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to the Commissioner-designate. I'd like to know what you're going to do to ensure that Europe is prepared for the digital era and that no region is left behind. Now, for this, there are going to have to be smart specialisation plans to ensure digitalisation. So my question is, what will you do to ensure that structural funds play a fundamental role, for example, in the industrial and strategy and innovation strategy, that we have strong strategies that cover all European regions, including the less developed regions? Also, in some area, there might be a bit of overlap between your portfolio and democracy and demography. For example, less populated rural areas, for example, and brain drain. So what will you do to ensure that there's cooperation with that portfolio? And how will you tackle these issues that are going to be fundamental in the future, digitalization and innovation?
Gracias. Eu penso que essa questão é uma...
I think this is a really central issue. What we're doing, what we're asking for in this Commission proposal is that the projects that are presented should fulfill two fundamental objectives. So, what we usually call a smarter Europe, a more innovative economy with more technology, but doesn't leave the least developed regions stuck clinging on to obsolete technologies that don't allow them to grow properly. And the second objective is a greener Europe, more compatible with our environmental objectives. There's something that we called thematic concentration, and that means that for each type of region, there's a minimum requirement for each of those two dimensions. So even the weakest regions and the poorest countries, I mean, we can move from the regional level to the country level. The countries that are having the biggest difficulties in finding the right projects should see 1/3 of that investment towards Objective 1 and 30% for Objective 2, for example. Now, these requirements are going to depend upon the typology of the region. What we don't want to do is to have a kind of segmentation. You have some regions that are much more innovative and the others that are left behind. I should make one note there. Policies that are managed centrally are going to have to be understood in terms of their spatial territorial impact. We cannot have all of the strategic investments focused on the most developed parts of the countries. I think that this is very worrying when it happens. We have to take this into account. We have to look at this spatial impact of sectoral policies.
Ferreira, Madam Ferreira, something that's very important to us is how we can simplify the funds. There are some regions that have a lot of problems in getting funds for even the most basic projects. So what measures are you going to take to ensure that these funds could be used in more complex projects, such as innovation projects? And what would your proposals be to improve efficacy and effectiveness in the use of funds, improve technical assistance, for example? What can we do to basically improve the implementation level of funds?
Thank you. Well, the question that you're asking depends on the quality of institutions, the quality of the structures available, the quality of the fabric of the society where these investments are going to be made. So we need to think seriously about all of the different aspects as to how we can provide technical support to make programs effective. We want development, but not development at any price. We want development that is environmentally useful and sustainable, and also we want to see a development of new technologies. So I think that there is space within this proposal for all of the things I've spoken of. The question is to try and find the right recipe so that we can ensure that everybody wins. We have to place trust in the local stakeholders to try and ensure that the projects that are put forward are winning projects that are sustainable.
Thank you very much. Rosa D'Amato. Welcome, Commissioner-designate. I'm over here. In plenary last month, the Parliament said more flexibility is required for national co-financing of Stability and Growth Pact areas. And you are announcing that in the new Commission there will be a debate, in other words, a rethink about the criteria in the Stability and Growth Pact. And this is particularly sensitive because of growth and employment in the less developed regions. Can you confirm your determination to ensure that national co-financing of green investments can be taken out of the calculation for the deficit? Because this Parliament, in the last mandate, has got a strong track record in this area. And we were told then that there would not be an exception made. There would be no exceptions. Can we expect some change on this question of what is counted towards the Stability and Growth Pact and the deficit? Thank you.
Muito obrigada.
Thank you. Well, as I said, all of these subjects need to be discussed. There's a reanalysis of the SGP, which is not under my leadership. A lot of this needs to be looked at. A lot needs to be reviewed. But it is a process. It's a complex process, and it's a long, drawn-out process. And it requires co-decision as well. We would be interfering with European legislation. So this is in the hands of my colleague who is in charge of the economy. And I can guarantee to you that I will be involved in that debate, and I will be trying to ensure that the whole package is better organized, but I can't guarantee the results.
Thank you. Just one thing, and it's still to do with the Stability and Growth Pact. How do you intend to help local authorities and municipalities? Because their administrative capacity is not all it could be. Technical assistance sounds fine, but that's not enough in itself if it's not properly used. And that means, of course, more controls to monitor how it works out at ground level. It's a problem because co-financing can mean that because of the Stability and Growth Pact, money is not being invested where it's needed most. Thank you.
Há muitos elementos nessa.
Well, there's a lot of parts to your question. You talked about controls. Controls are needed. There's a whole chain of responsibility for the use of European money, and we're accountable to our citizens. It's citizens' money, so we cannot do without the necessary controls. What the Commission is trying to do in its proposals is to try and make things more simpler, more operational, more readable, particularly for small companies and small beneficiaries. But having said that, controls have to exist. It's a huge responsibility to manage money that belongs to our citizens, that our citizens have paid as tax. So quality has to be reinforced. We cannot create new mechanisms that don't bring in added value. And it's important to have control of whether the money was properly spent. But there is a lot of work to be done also on improving the substance of projects. Projects need to be checked and controlled, but they do need to have an impact on the territories. The necessary work is going on, but improvements can be made. The proposals are being discussed right now, and I think that that will improve things. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Je vais à présent laisser la parole.
Next, Margarida Marquez, who is a member of the Budget Committee.
Président, cara comissária.
Commissioner-designate, I think that it has to be clear all of the countries of the EU have been beneficiaries of the cohesion policy, either directly or indirectly. Portugal is a country where the results of cohesion policy is very visible. We all know that you're here in this hearing to become a European Commissioner and not a minister in a Portuguese government. Portugal will respect Article 245 of the treaty. In this new generation of cohesion policies, the cohesion objective, which is a founding objective of the EU, has to be present in all European policies. Therefore, financing of cohesion goes far beyond simply the envelopes of funding that are attributed to cohesion itself. I'd like to know if your ambition for the future of cohesion policy is going along the same lines. And I must say I was very happy to hear that you were very open to cooperation with the Parliament in order to improve the Commission's proposal and get down to negotiations as soon as possible to get a timely agreement for the MFF.
Obrigada.
Thank you very much. I agree with everything that you said. It's a comment that I think is correct and timely. And it fits in with our main concerns. The situation that we're in is one with a certain level of fragility in terms of the European budget. There may be a need for us to go back and have a look with the Council during the negotiations, that we might need to make changes. And of course I'll be actively involved in the negotiations. I think it would be welcome if it was possible to move in the direction of the Parliament. It would be welcome and it would be interesting, but structurally the debate on own resources and alternatives has to return to the agenda. We've got more needs out there. We've got increasingly diverse needs. And we've got the exit of the United Kingdom causing a major strain on resources. The Commission is a technical body. And what we can discuss is how we can all contribute to trying to create a shared sense of responsibility. Within the Commission, we're all bringing our experiences, our skills, and our different views. Of course, there are differences of views. And as you'll see in the hearings with the Commission's designate.
Penso que estará de acordo o instrumento.
Well, I'm sure you'll agree that the instrument for convergence and competitiveness in the Eurozone has to be complementary with existing instruments and provide added value. It's important that it has to be designed taking into account the economic cycle. Now, how can this instrument be modulated so that it can take into account serious slowdowns in the economy And if there is a problem with convergence and competitiveness, how can you use the right distribution criteria to ensure how to best fulfill the objectives? Well, thank you once again. What you're talking about is the BICC. That's the abbreviation. The BICC is primarily aimed at financing structural policies in the member states. And I like to use the term structural policy because it's structural reform rather, because they can be positive in reforming the public administration or the education system or the health system, or as I said in my introductory remarks, that it can be a way to look at how you manage forests to try and prevent environmental damage, as has happened in the case of forest fires. So the whole idea of the instrument is it should compensate countries that are members of the Eurozone so that their structural reforms are not limited by the fact that they don't have enough budgetary space. Otherwise, they might not be able to implement these policies whilst fitting in with the framework for public finances. Of course, this instrument is based on the experience of the previous Commission term, where there was only technical support. Those countries that made efforts to join the single currency will now find that there is a similar system as well. I'll give you more details about that in due course.
Merci beaucoup. Lida.
Thank you, Lydia Ferreira for Econ.
Muito obrigada, Sr. Presidente.
Thank you very much, Chair. Commissioner-designate, periods of economic growth are an opportunity for countries to engage in structural reform. Electoral campaigns represent temptations for governments. If you're in a country like Portugal with high debt levels, Greece or Italy are also examples, then it's difficult to carry out structural reforms. But the Eurogroup is pretty much blocked. We haven't been able to reform the Eurozone. And now we've got Mario Centeno, the Ronaldo who's never scored a goal. He's never carried out any structural reforms in his own country, or any reforms in the Eurozone either. So, in your written responses, you talk about the functioning of schools and other structural reforms, but it seems that these never take place. Europe's citizens need to know what kind of reforms you'd like to see. What kind of things need to change in the employment market? What needs to change in schools and hospitals?
Deputada, muito gosto.
Well, I must say it's a great pleasure to respond to your question. What you were saying does have respect to national politics, and I don't want to comment on that part. As for your question about what I would like to see, of course I will respond to you. It's not what I want. It's actually the countries concerned that will need to discuss these issues as part of the European semester. They will have to identify the policies that would be required as part of the semester. They have to propose them and implement them. In many cases, these are policies involving reorganization, and this can cost money. So it's when there's a strategy that's up to each member state to define. Policies cannot be imposed. So you've got the country-specific recommendations, but they need to be negotiated, and each country should come with its proposals. Thank you for that response. I could just make one comment. The Eurogroup is not national politics. As for structural reforms, You said that the needs for structural reforms are different in each country. But I assume that the Commission has to have a line that would unify the approach. You've still got some time to respond properly if you so wish. But then on the convergence instrument, will you be involved in the implementation of this, the BIC? So, I must say your answers were rather disappointing. You seem to be reducing the great ambition that we hold as strong Europeans, which is to have a common Eurozone budget. But rather, this seems to be all about little troikas for every country, a troika for each sector, a troika for the employment market, a troika for education, and a troika for health. Is that your ambition for this instrument? For the budgetary capacity of the Eurozone? Or do you want to do something a little bit more so that we don't end up just being disappointed at the end of the day?
É com muito prazer que eu...
Well, I would wish with great pleasure that I'd like to distance myself from this idea of little troikas. And it's nice to hear you do so too. Of course, I have fought troikas in the past, and a lot has changed in Europe in the meantime. Economic policy has also changed. The European semester is an instrument that I think provides a better framework for dealing with imbalances within the Eurozone. We're all working on fine-tuning these processes. It's up to the countries themselves to make proposals. So that's actually the opposite to the Troika. The problem with the Troika is that because Europe did not have a proper structure for this, it created something that I think didn't really function. But with the six-pack and the European semester, there are a number of interesting proposals, and I think that you should have a look at the country-specific recommendations and structural reforms. So, the reform plans for each country, that is. Look at the details that are in there, particularly in Annex D. That has the list of the types of projects that the countries have to implement. But it's up to the countries to choose what they're prepared to commit to doing. I think that that's major progress, and it's a critical issue for the functioning of the Eurozone.
Merci, José.
Thank you, José Guzmão, for Econ.
Obrigado, Sr. Presidente. Obrigado.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Commissioner-designate. You were saying that economic policy in Europe has changed a lot. I'm not so sure about that. Everyone's talking about investment, that's true, but what has investment policy been? It's just been trying to support growth. But what about redistribution? But what we've got instead is the European semester and the cutbacks in the cohesion funding. Now, a possible scenario or a working hypothesis, but with the support of the Parliament, will you work to ensure that there is no cut to cohesion funding? And that should be the worst case scenario. And will you support the idea that investment, particularly investment in combating inequality and poverty, investment in public services and in fighting climate change, should not be taken into account in complying with the deficit rules?
Sr. Deputado, é com muito gosto que lhe respondo.
It's a pleasure to respond. Yes, the functioning of the European semester and the Stability and Growth Pact have been subject to considerable progress. Well, should I be saying that this is the perfect mode of functioning, that everything is ideal? Well, I think that there's still a road that needs to be followed. Europe is constructed step by step. Of course, we have to keep going through that path of correcting errors and improving. So I think that we can continue to work. As for the other aspects of your questions, I think I've already commented on a couple of those. I don't think that we should be constantly insisting on that point. We've got budgetary cuts in the scenario. If the co-legislators increase the ceiling, then I think that's very good and very welcome. Obviously, I think the cohesion policy needs to be protected. And Pillar 2 in particular, that's to say agriculture. A lot of cohesion policy requires a very close relationship between agricultural reform and cohesion funding. It's key for rural areas. So it's important that we should have enough resources to deal with the problems that emerge over time as well. So I will be fighting for this issue because it's my own portfolio, but I think it's also key for dynamizing the internal market. That's already necessary, but it's all the more necessary when you have a single currency. It leads to a very difficult situation to manage when you've got the different economies performing differently. We all know that in theory, and we all know how it works in practice, so there is still a way to go.
Princípio da condicionalidade tem significado básico.
Conditionality has basically worked in the following manner. The countries that fulfill the rules of the European Commission have some room for manoeuvre. Those that don't follow the rules of the Commission end up with trouble. So what are we talking about when we talk about the reforms that are within your portfolio? Is it the old style, employment market deregulation, cutbacks to public services, privatizations, or are we talking about something else entirely? But more important than that, if we've got an understanding of what responsible economic policies are, if the Commission has carried out responsibility, if our country has ended up in the biggest recession in the Eurozone as a result of the Commission's responsible policies, then I think we have to remember reforms must not be imposed. So will you make a commitment? Will you refuse to use the payout of structural cohesion funds as a means of exchange for fulfilling the Commission's recommendations? Well, indeed. Cohesion policy in the strictest sense of the term is subject to legislation in force, and that is subject to macroeconomic conditionality. The current proposal of the Commission has measures to mitigate this element, that there would be various mitigating factors that would even cancel the macroeconomic conditionality. I've taken good note of the Parliament's position, which is very much against all of this. As I see it, what we need to do now in the field of structural reforms is we need to build policies that improve the competitiveness of these countries. It's not an issue that I decide on alone. Parliament, Council and Commission need to debate this together closely. Of course, I support the co-decision process.
Merci, Alfred.
Thank you, Alfred Sant. From Econ.
You cannot tell us about what the Just Transition Fund will consist of. But can I ask you about what your position would be when it's going to be discussed, when it's going to be implemented? 3 questions. First, how would you ensure that the Just Transition Fund would not only be limited to environmental impacts, but would also cover related socio-economic impacts, notably on European workers? Secondly, will you commit to fight that the new fund will not end up like EFSI, based on leveraged funds, not so different from European Investment Bank allocations, that go to the best performing regions? And thirdly, as you know, the June 2019 European Council conclusions clearly mention the need to take member states' national circumstances into account during the transition to a climate-neutral EU. Will you fight for the Just Transition Fund to actively support islands and peripheral regions to overcome their specific handicaps, especially when running cleaner energy systems and transport connections?
Honourable Member, dear Alfred Sand, I take good note of your questions and of your ambitions. You started by saying that I cannot assume compromises here. We are all working on this. You will have some news in 100 days after the empowerment of the Commission. But we are working very, very actively on this. You put a question on, do you think that this fund should also tackle issues in islands? It depends. I think we cannot see this Just Transition Fund also because of its limited, you were talking about here in the Parliament, about 4.8 billion. So this fund has got to be included and packaged together with the cohesion funds. We'll have to make sure that we articulate things in such a way that we tackle the most serious problems of compliance, environmental compliance, but we'll have to look at the consolidated instruments that we have to tackle the different situations. For the time being, we know I would like to open it a little bit. We'll see if we can open it, and we'll see what are the mechanisms that we can use to leverage it. You mentioned in a negative sense, apparently, the EFSI, the Juncker plan, the Juncker program, the old. I will have to look at those instruments because we cannot segment everything that we do according to the funds. We have got to make them work together and leverage together. When you mentioned the social aspects, there I can answer you definitely yes. We have got to create some sort of mechanisms and some sort of joint intervention that by taking the ground as the basis, you apply social fund, the dimensions that relate to social integration of the regional funds, and you combine everything so that you make a sound program for the development of each area. Sorry.
Issue, but related to this. When you're dealing with peripheral regions and islands in terms of regional policy, do you see or do you find that there could be conflicts between what you would like to do in terms of private sector investment and the EU competition policy?
That's a very sophisticated question. It's not easy to answer in 1 minute because there are some waivers, as you know, in what concerns the islands in relation to the competition policy. And also we may have, for some special reasons, again, some waivers on competition policy. But this is something that has got to be fine-tuned to the concrete situations that we are faced with. But of course, there is this precedent that there are some waivers for competition policy when you are in a very limited island, for instance, in which you cannot force that competition will be really, guaranteed in the territory. So we'll see, we'll be working with you, with the Parliament, and we'll fine-tune the instrument so that it works. But let's not construct silos together, one with the other, in which each of them is duplicating the work that another fund is doing. That's my concern also.
Merci beaucoup, Gilles Evans.
Thank you very much. Jill Evans.
Thank you.
Commissioner-designate, the deindustrialisation of regions is a challenging task, and my constituency, Wales, has long experience of that process. But demographic change also affects those regions. You mentioned in your opening remarks about the bright young people who leave, and this is particularly true in rural areas. People move away for education and jobs, and then it's even more difficult to sustain services and retain young people in those communities. And it undermines progress on cohesion. So will you establish an expert commission or working group tasked with finding real solutions to reducing migration from these areas? There is also a link to the Interreg programme, and speaking as an MEP for a constituency that might soon be outside the EU, how would you encourage and facilitate our continuing participation in this very valuable cross-border programme?
Thank you very much for your question. You have tackled an issue that is really a very crucial thing. I think all of us, or most of us, depending the countries or regions where you come from, we have seen this incredible effort to give more education, more training, and to invest on people. And then, of course, the wages are not that high, and they are forced to leave. And this brain drain is something that really, really deserves our attention. I would say, instinctively, I would say yes, I'll create an expert group. I don't know, honestly, if a similar thing already exists inside the right services, the DGs. So I'll take a look at it. I'll discuss with the staff and find out, because I know that they share this concern. We were discussing it, and yes, if you lose the right people, of course, these people, they have got to find occupations that are compatible with their skills, and for that you have got to have public administration, and you have got to have the capacity to attract investment and to attract enterprises to those regions. And this has either it is a package or it doesn't work. So, but it is a serious concern. I take it very, very at heart, and I can just promise that I will look carefully at that so that we tackle this precise issue that you have mentioned.
And can I follow up with a related question on gender equality and gender mainstreaming, because your commitment to this is welcomed by myself and my group, but how to translate this into action is the question, because there still is no clear gender equality strategy with specific objectives and targets and allocations in the new MFF framework, and no gender disaggregated data so that policymakers can develop appropriate and evidence-based policies. So I'd like to ask as well what steps you will be taking to ensure that gender budgeting will become an integral part of cohesion policy during the next MFF. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm very sensitive to that, and thank you very much also for having raised this issue, because there are so many aspects that I really want to have the chance to reinforce my concern in relation to that. So we'll try in any possible way to address this capacity to implement programs having this element in concern. There are new enabling conditions for the use of funds. Lots of them are there, and I think somehow this gender equilibrium can fit into more general principles that now are enabling conditions for the management of the funds. And inside my own DG, I looked at the human resources. So I'm speaking now about DG Regio, and for instance, the scoreboard mentioned that there is a high workload and that there is lack of work-life balance. And then there is less, in the DG ratio, the number of female managers is proportionally smaller than in the overall Commission. So I think we have got to look carefully also internally to these aspects, because this is the way that, in a hidden way, you get sometimes women sent away from the top management, and this Commission has special responsibilities in relation to this aspect too.
Merci beaucoup, Stéphane.
Thank you, Stéphane Bijou. Thank you, Chair. Good evening, Madam Commissioner-designate. Europe is a territory of challenges, but also a great territory of hope. Hope for dignity in the face of unemployment, security in the face of climate deregulation, and equal opportunities for everyone. And we have responsibilities collectively, which is to bring practical responses to these legitimate concerns of our citizens across Europe, wherever they live, even if they are 10,000 kilometres away in the outermost regions, particularly the French overseas territories, which now require us to be much more efficient in our cohesion policy. And I would make a plea that we boost efficiency and have an outermost region reflex. We need to mainstream that in fisheries, in youth policy. I think that you will always have to mobilise all of your colleagues in future. You've said and you've written that no one would be left behind. And I believe you 100%. You described the urgent requests, urgent demands, but can I ask you to really sign up to that and to commit yourself to permanent vigilance and practical measures for the furthest away and most vulnerable populations in Europe?
Well, it's quite easy to respond to that. Of course, it's yes. I am very committed to precisely that subject. It's a collective responsibility to try and ensure that we give special attention to the regions that are furthest away. Of course, it's not just the outermost regions. We have to pay a lot of attention to them. But the outermost regions have a genetic propensity to be in that situation.
Merci pour l'engagement.
Well, thank you very much. Can I ask, on the methods, the organisation of the different your DG compared to other colleagues in the Commission, other departments, why not have a quarterly platform with the relevant commissioners, members of the European Parliament and representatives from civil society, so that on a regular basis we could have these cross-cutting get-togethers?
Thank you for that proposal. I'll certainly think about it. I mean, why not? I'll discuss it with the services and maybe we'll find a solution. But I can't promise you right now that we'll be able to do it. But I will very seriously analyse your proposal.
Thank you, José Manuel Fernandez from the Budget Committee.
Le Président, car
Thank you, Chairman. Commissioner-designate, competence, ambition and courage make the difference. Given the similar constraints, some commissioners have done a good job, others have not done a good job. Carlos Moedas managed to get 80 billion euros for research, and he made a proposal for 100 million, a 25% increase. But the Commissioner for Cohesion left us with a proposal with serious cuts to the overall amount. And for Portugal, we're talking about 1.6 billion euro cut. I don't know how we can accept these kind of cuts. But the Cohesion Fund itself is intended for the poorest countries. The Cohesion Fund in the Commission's proposal suffers a 45% cut. That's an absolutely unacceptable cutback. So, in your opinion, can we continue to call it a cohesion policy under the current circumstances? This cutback of 45%, I mean, I don't think is going to allow for any kind of cohesion. So what's the best case scenario? Is cohesion going to be maintained as a priority? There are written answers that you submitted where you say that it's the best case scenario and these are moderate cuts. But does this mean that you've just thrown in the towel? Are you resigned? I think that actually is going to damage the negotiating position of the Parliament. Well, thank you very much for that question. A lot of colleagues have already asked a similar question. I've already responded to all of those colleagues, so I won't continue banging on about the same things. I hope that you're all clear that I see this as a good basis for work. It's the only possibility. The alternative would be to reject it and completely rework the proposal. But that doesn't mean that this isn't just a basis to be negotiated, to be worked upon. Of course, there will be trilogues, and I'm sure that tomorrow there will be another trilogue as part of those ongoing negotiations. And let's see how we can push the limits of the budget. But you talked about Portugal. You talked about the seriousness of this cutback as you see it. But I'll just remind you of this. And maybe you've already forgotten about it, but at current prices, the constant prices, we've got a reduction of 7%. Well, in the changeover between 2013 and 2016, when we moved into the current system for 2014 to 2020, the cutback was 10.5%. When you said that there's 1.6 less for Portugal, but last time round it was 2.3% down. So you have to see history in a little bit of longer perspective. This time there's Brexit. So I don't know if things were as intense and emotional that last time round, but this time we have very specific circumstances. We shouldn't simply be looking at what Commissioner Moedas has done under the present circumstances, and I very much admire what he's done. But you have to look at the financial perspectives. The situation was much better back in 2014. So those are the values. There's no point in insisting upon it. Indeed, my eyes are set on you, and I hope that your negotiations with the Council go very well. You can always count on support from the Commission and on my personal support too.
Muito obrigado. A sua resposta acaba por me dar.
Well, thank you. I think you basically proved me right. If there was a 10% cut last time round, and then on top of that cutback, you've got another 7% cut, then it suggests that, well, basically it suggests that if you didn't agree with the cutback last time, you can't agree with the cut on top of the cut. But what about the distribution formula? Nobody understands why there are some countries that are rich and are getting more, and that there are poor countries that are suffering cutbacks.
Só que para que fique claro, não concordo.
Well, let me make it clear. I don't agree with any cuts, neither then nor now. What I was trying to do is to remind you of the atmosphere at that time round, but that's a different issue. Of course, I don't agree with any cuts. But you talked about reviewing the formula, the Berlin formula. I think that's what you're talking about. It's a very complex formula, I was not the one who designed it or reviewed it. In the year 2000, there was a debate on the issue of national prosperity, which I think made sense. Of course, we can fine-tune the formula, but you can't evaluate in such a simplistic manner. Poor countries have got cuts in relation to the past, but that's because that they have developed and grown. So if there is progress, which is what we want, then, as a matter of principle, they should actually have less capacity to absorb structural funds. The objective is not to constantly fund countries when they don't need them to converge.
Bien. Nous arrivons au terme.
Okay, thank you very much. This brings us up to this to the end of this round of questions. Madam Commissioner-designate, you will now be able to make a brief closing statement of 5 minutes, after which I will take the floor for just a couple of minutes, 1 or 2 minutes, in order to bring things to a close. Therefore, you have 5 minutes for your closing statement.
Merci bien, Monsieur le Président. I'd like just to underline that some of the main conclusions that I take, that are takeaways from this discussion. I think this discussion was extremely useful. It helped me to understand what the representatives of citizens want me to take into account if I am confirmed as Commissioner. I take your concerns in relation to the budget for cohesion policy, and I confirm that I will fight in the College of the Commission for the highest possible budget. On Just Transition Fund, I think there were important messages so that Cohesion and Just Transition Fund and reforms that they reinforce each other. There are some serious concerns on simplification, and I take them very, very seriously with me. There are concerns on what kind of reforms are we talking about, the reform agenda, what do we mean by that, what will be the method, so I take this with me. On the climate change action plan and on the contribution of cohesion policy and coherence of cohesion policy in relation to the environmental objectives, I also take them with me. Also on rural regions, the concerns that there is a convergence and the priority, and in particular everything that was referred in relation to the outermost regions of Europe. The concern with the gender budgeting, the gender equilibrium, and the gender element in everything that we do, and naturally on partnership and involvement of local partners and stakeholders. So I take this very seriously with me. I just mentioned some highlights. I mentioned also that I would be also in dialogue with all of you, but before that, I could not, in my preparatory work, meet other partners, other elements that I think I should meet, like Committee of the Regions, the European Economic and Social Committee, even the European Court of Auditors, the European Investment Bank. So I will keep, if I'm confirmed, a close relationship with them and also with the managers of the different funds that we have in Europe, so that we make packages that can really make the whole thing be bigger than the adding up of the parts. Locally, I will be in contact with member states, with regions, with cities, and with locals. I will try to visit all the regions during the first 6 months. And naturally, inside the Commission, I will work with all the colleagues. And it's difficult to produce good results in regional development if we are not in close contact and in cooperation with transports, with economy, with energy, with environment, with the jobs, with economy. So I really think we have got to work as a team, and I ask you to help me to work as a team. To finish, I would just like, because I don't have another way to do this, to thank everybody that helped me to prepare this presentation and my answers. In particular, all these people that work in services and that were absolutely patient, very professional, and always willing to answer all my questions. So that I could update myself to come and to present myself in front of you and to try to reply and to answer adequately to your questions. I would also like to thank the interpreters, because they are the ones that prevent us from being lost in translation. And thank you to all of you. From my point of view, it was really a very interesting discussion, and I really enjoyed it immensely. Thank you very much. Merci bien, Monsieur le Président.
Madame la commissaire désignée.
Madam Commissioner-designate. Madam Commissioner-designate. I think that round of applause speaks for itself. Those are the thanks of our committees for the responses, for the replies you've given to the questions which members have addressed to you. And I do sincerely want to thank colleagues for the high quality of your questions, because we have touched all the bases. We have looked at all of the aspects and the dimensions which will now enable us to form an opinion, to have our evaluation with the coordinators in order to see whether we can confirm you in the post of Commissioner. And it was very important for us to have a long hearing, one which asked tough questions, and one which rose to great heights of quality. And I believe that this hearing by the Regi Committee this evening and the debate which we have had has been of a very high quality indeed. Now, I do not want to detain you, contrary to past experience, because we have to respect the protocol. And now we have to go off, have our meeting of coordinators in order to proceed to a very punctilious assessment of all of the questions which you have given to all of the questions, covering that wide range of the whole spectrum of dimensions. Thank you very much, Madam, for your contribution. And I would ask members and coordinators to meet. It's going to be in camera tomorrow morning between 10 and 12:30 in ASP 5E2. And then after that, we'll be able to draw up our opinion, which we will then address to the Conference of Committee Chairs. Thanks everyone for your active participation, and a big thank you, says the Chair, to the interpreters for their outstanding performance this afternoon and this evening.